Tosh Dile Kedolla, and to all the lovely audience tuning in from across the globe. Welcome to the virtual event of Freedom Hour, an online discussion hosted by Asia Freedom Institute, a non-profit organization that promotes democracy and religious freedom in Tibet and China. I'm Sakina Bhatt, and I'm the moderator for today's discussion on reimagining Tibetan democracy and governance. We are gathered here to explore an insightful and forward thinking report authored by Kelsang Aukatsang, who has not only been a key figure in the Tibetan community, but also a presidential candidate in the 2021 Tibetan general election, and he is the founding president of Asia Freedom Institute. It's my honor to introduce you to Kelsang Aukatsang. Welcome to AFI's Freedom Hour discussion, Kedolla.
Thank you, Sakina. Good evening to you.
Good evening. Ani, Kedolla, so before I start, I just want to tell our viewers about the agenda for today. It's going to be really simple. We are just going to have 11 questions, and we are going to, that's it. So let me begin with the first question. And also, I want to tell that I want to inform our viewers that I have kept Kedolla's introduction really short, but if you want to get the full bio, you can always go to Asia Freedom Institute's website. So, Kedolla, to begin with, what inspired or led you to write Reimagining Tibetan Democracy and Governance, which was published by Asia Freedom Institute on 2nd of September, which was the Tibetan Democracy Day? And what are the key objectives of the position paper, Kedolla?
Yes, so thanks again for making this possible, Sakina, and greetings to all of the audience out there. So I think, everything is really about timing because the current situation with regards to the Tibetan Government-in-Exile especially, I think there's a confluence of different issues and developments all kind of coming together. So, just based on my experience of having worked very closely in the Tibetan community at various levels, there were certain issues which I felt really needed to be addressed. And some of the ideas and proposals in the position paper, honestly, I don't think it's really even a matter of choice for the Tibetan community because some of them are really imperative. And we get into that more later. But I think just a combination of just different issues happening both internally in the community and especially the situation at home in Tibet. And so, a combination of the two, I felt has really positioned the community right now at this particular juncture. So it's almost like the comparison I'd like to make is, 1959, when His Holiness the Dalai Lama and almost 80,000 Tibetans had to flee Chinese persecution and flee into exile in India and Nepal. That was obviously a very, very traumatic event in modern Tibetan history. But I feel that the community is now on the cusp of an equally momentous and very challenging period as well. And we can get more into this later. But so it's really to answer your question more directly. It's really about the timing, and based on just my observation of where we are as a community and where we are as a freedom movement, that some of these issues that are highlighted in the position paper really needs to be articulated. And my hope is that not only is this really in some ways a wake-up call, both in terms of the challenges that we face as a community, but also to seize on the opportunities which are also present, right? So it's not only a wake-up call, but equally important, my hope is that through this position paper, we can finally really begin to advance and elevate discourse within the community on some of these important issues related to Tibetan democracy and Tibetan governance in exile.
Thank you, Kedola. And it is clear that your deep commitment to the Tibetan community and your unique experiences have shaped this forward thinking vision. And the key objectives that you outlined truly highlight the urgent need for evolution within the CTA. And talking about CTA, most people view the story of Tibetan democracy and governance in exile as positive and unique. So, can you tell us some of the defining characteristics of Tibetan democracy and governance in exile, and also the factors that have contributed to its growth, Kedola?
Sure, yeah. Let me begin by saying that, His Holiness the Dalai Lama's name will always, always be associated with peace, nonviolence, and compassion. But I think equally important, one of his most enduring legacies will also be his effort and his commitment to democracy. And the clearest manifestation of this really is this establishment called the Central Tibetan Administration, which used to be formally called the Tibetan Government-in-Exile, which was created in 1959, right after His Holiness and many of our elders came into exile. I can say a lot about the Central Tibetan Administration, but to kind of really break it down in a way that's accessible is we can compare the Tibetan establishment, the CTA, as any other government of a free nation. And thanks to the government of India, which hosted both His Holiness and the Tibetan refugee community for all these years, so they allowed that space. They gave Tibetans a freedom which they didn't have back in Tibet to really build this establishment from scratch. And what His Holiness and the Tibetan elders envisioned was now that they had relatively more freedom, they wanted to really lay the foundation of a society, a community that was based on democracy, on democratic values. So accordingly, the Tibetan leadership in exile went about creating this structure, creating this foundation, and it's almost as if the Tibetan community is living in its own autonomous state, because as I've mentioned in the paper, the CTA is like any other government in the sense that we have the three pillars of democracy. You have the executive, you have the legislative, and the judiciary. And especially after His Holiness the Dalai Lama devolved all his political and administrative power over to an elected Tibetan leadership, now the CTA is essentially headed up by, on the executive side, you have someone who's democratically elected by the Tibetan people, obviously not inside Tibet, but Tibetans living in free nations. So those who are eligible can, every 5 years, they can not only vote for the president, whom Tibetans call a Sipyong, but also in the parliament in exile, you have 45 parliamentarians who are representing, everybody, all Tibetans everywhere. And so you have a very functioning executive, then you have a legislature that meets twice a year. And then, of course, you also have the third pillar, which is the judiciary. So amongst these three pillars, where the power and the responsibilities are really, in a way, the way it's conceived, it's distributed equally across the three pillars. And what the elders who put this system together, this foundation together, what they envisioned was to have each pillar serve as a check and balance on the other. And that's how it's essentially really worked for all these 65 years. So it's been 65 years now since the establishment of the Central Tibetan Administration. And it's been a very successful model by and large in terms of how it's operating at the headquarters, which is based in Dharamsala in northern India, where His Holiness the Dalai Lama also resides. But then the structure is replicated across almost 44 settlements across India and Nepal, where you have at the settlement level, you have also the local assemblies, you have the settlement officers, also then you have the 3 regional justice commissions, right? So it's CTA, it's really a reflection of the reforms and the ideas that His Holiness the Dalai Lama had back when he was in Tibet, and you know, for very obvious reasons that have to do with the lack of freedom and the repression by the Chinese Communist government, many of these ideas could not be implemented in Tibet. So as soon as he was able to come into exile, and with the freedom that he had, he went about working, you know, towards some of these goals. And today, what you have is it's by and large a very robust and functioning Tibetan democracy, where you have you know, the people electing their leaders, and the leaders are based in Dharamsala. So obviously there are challenges and issues which we'll get into later in the session, but really the structure itself, the way it was built 65 years ago, was done with a lot of foresight and taking into account the needs of the people. And again, I have to say that the whole architecture is really based on the situation inside Tibet. Again, we can discuss this more later, but it's really modeled, and it's really based on the needs and the conditions that exist inside Tibet. Because the goal here is that, you know, Tibetans don't expect to be in exile forever. So the hope is, how do you establish these democratic institutions and practices, and then one fine day, when Tibet becomes free, you can actually take this back and replicate this in Tibet, obviously with the participation and input of the 6 million Tibetans back home.
Thank you, Kedola, for walking us through the functioning of the CTA, and also mentioning about the efforts made by His Holiness the Dalai Lama to the growth of the CTA. And also in your paper, you highlighted the differences between the early days of the Central Tibetan Administration and the Tibetan democracy in the 1960s, and also the current situation. So what are the most significant changes that have taken place since then? And how are these changes influenced, how have these changes influenced the reforms that you proposed in the paper?
Yeah, the conditions, Sakina, could not be really more different in terms of where we were 65 years ago and the realities and the conditions existing today. What you have to take note of is 65 years ago, when Tibetans had to leave Tibet, I mean, Tibetans came as almost complete destitutes, right? You had nothing. I mean, there's even the way Tibetans describe it is, you know, all they saw was the sky above and the ground below. So they barely had just time to, you know, just organize things so that they could leave right away, because the situation was that dramatic. And when they came into exile, both His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, and the Tibetan leadership at that time, they had this twin responsibility, as I would say. One is to obviously, you know, continue to wage the freedom struggle and counter the action and what the Chinese government had done in terms of invading, occupying, and just repressing the population in Tibet. But then you also had 80,000 people plus, almost on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, you had people fleeing across the Himalayas. And over time, you know, this population went up to as high as 150,000 people. So you had to really take care of this new refugee population. You had to house them, you had to feed them, you had to educate them, you had to also, on a parallel track, you also had to rebuild, you know, some of these very historic and the precious cultural institutions which were being destroyed back in Tibet. And it's so that was the responsibility at that time, in terms of just the existing conditions and the environments that the Tibetan refugee community kind of stepped into. That was 65 years ago. So now, when you kind of make that leap forward, across all these past decades, what we're seeing is, and there are many things happening, but my paper highlights three key issues, which really, in some ways, drive a lot of the things which are being proposed in the paper in terms of reforms, in terms of changes that we need to institute. First and foremost, the number of Tibetans who are escaping Tibet and who are kind of coming across the border has really now decreased to a number which is barely, it barely reaches 100, annually. So you have very few new refugee arrivals coming into India and Nepal. And my paper highlights the reasons for why this is so. And I don't want to get into too much detail here, but it has to do with increasing repression in Tibet, the militarization of the whole border with India and Nepal. And then you have, some of the policies that the Chinese government has instituted in Tibet in terms of surveillance, in terms of urbanizations, and just other developments. Because of a combination of all those reasons, you now have a situation where from a peak of 3,500 to 4,000 up to 2008, that was the situation. You had people coming mainly through Nepal, but now the numbers are very, very low, and I don't think the numbers will increase significantly anytime soon. So that's one major change that's happening, and this is important because a lot of the systems and structures and practices and infrastructure that was built in exile was done so with the anticipation and with the assumption that the flow of refugees, new refugees from Tibet, will at least continue for quite a while, and that's not really happening. So that's one. Secondly, you have a reverse thing happening. In terms of instead of people from Tibet coming into India and Nepal, you have this outbound migration in terms of people looking for better opportunities, mostly to the West, in places like North America and Europe and Australia. And this is a trend which I think will continue because there's migration happening, and then families, once they make it to overseas, then they in turn invite and sort of pull their families over. There are also people who are independently traveling abroad and then applying for asylum and doing so successfully. That's the other major thing happening, which has ramification for really everything that related to the CTA and the setup in the refugee community in India and Nepal. And the third thing, which I don't think gets mentioned enough, but I think what's happening is, and this is in some ways not surprising, I mean, from total destitutes now, I would say that the Tibetan community, especially in diaspora, and also to a large extent to communities in India and Nepal, the community has successfully, I think, transitioned from being destitute to some level of self-sustenance. So now today, economically, I think many Tibetan families are somewhat self-reliant. And again, I think this is a factor which the Tibetan exile leadership needs to take into account, because earlier when people were all in great need of help, that was the basic orientation of CTA. But now, as more and more people are self-reliant, I think you have to accordingly then adjust and restructure the program and some of the activities as well. So I would say there are many issues happening, but in terms of the three most important, I would say, yeah, just to summarize, the decrease in the flow of new refugees from Tibet, the increased outbound migration that's happening from India and Nepal to mainly to the West, and then this increasingly sort of self-reliant nature of the Tibetan exile community. So those three, I think, are really key issues which the current Tibetan leadership, as well as also those of those in the community who are following, these issues, they really need to take into account in terms of how you then factor that into as you debate and shape policy, and as you launch programs and readjust, I would say, the direction of the community.
Thank you so much, Kedola, for talking about the Tibetan refugees in exile and how they have developed. And maybe that's why Tibetan refugees are considered as one of the most successful refugees in the world. And Kedola, the other three issues that you identified in the paper, I think is really important. And you really want these issues for the CTA and the Tibetan people and the Tibetan community to consider. So can you please tell us about that as well, and why, in your view, this constitute the most critical issues?
Sure. Yeah, I've made a separation between key tipping points and key issues, right? I think there is a slight distinction between the two. So the three earlier issues that I outlined, those I would really define more as tipping points, things which have inherently changed within the community, which should inform new direction, which should inform changes, that's I think what's happening. But in terms of at the macro level, three really important issues which are absolutely pertinent to the discussion we're having now, and which is the driving, I would say, force behind why I felt the need to do the research and write the position paper. The first one is what's happening inside Tibet. As we all know, the Tibetan exile community is really essentially it's a freedom movement. The reason why Tibetans left Tibet 65 years ago was to, in opposition to the invasion, occupation, and the repression. And every Tibetan, regardless of your age and your background, the aspiration is to be able to go back and restore the freedom and dignity of people in Tibet, right? So what's happening in Tibet is obviously instrumental in all our discussions and in all our work. But unfortunately, what's happening in Tibet is today Tibetans are having to deal with a Chinese leader who does not believe in dialogue and who does not really believe in reconciliation. I would make a distinction between the pre-Xi Jinping and the post-Xi Jinping era. In the pre-Xi Jinping era, the way I see it is there was at least some token policy, some gestures which recognized Tibetans as ethnically and as a people separate from the Chinese population. And so there was some recognition of just the different histories, and accordingly, I think even though they did not amount to much, but I think there was some gestures and efforts made to recognize and partially address the grievances and the issues raised by the Tibetans. But what's happened with Xi Jinping's arrival on the scene is they have now shifted away from that kind of a posture and stance to a complete, transition to a very, very hardline policy of, I would say, total assimilation. And this is something which not just Tibetans, but also, our brothers and sisters within the Uyghur community, as well as the Southern Mongolians, and I would even put Hong Kong people in there as well. Something which Taiwan should also be very, very wary of. is there is now no, I think, intent on the part of Xi Jinping and the current Chinese leadership to really address these very genuine issues. And they have now decided that the best way forward is, and they have the power, right? They have the power, they have the number, they have almost complete control. And so they want to now just, take this big hammer and just make every Tibetan, every Uyghur, every Southern Mongolian into a Han Chinese. And so the language, the culture, the identity, everything is being subsumed and integrated and assimilated into, into China as a one nation, one people, one language, one culture, and no religion. So that's really the situation. So it raises basic questions of, in that kind of an environment, with that kind of a leader, with that kind of a policy, what should the Tibetan response be? Should we still stick to what we've been saying all these decades in terms of dialogue, in terms of what our basic approach is? So really, I don't have any specific recommendations on that, but it's really a moment when everything we're doing should be questioned, because that's really the adversary we are confronting at the moment. So I would say that is the number one issue. The second issue is and this is something which is looming, right? I mean, I was just here recently when His Holiness the Dalai Lama, after having undergone a very successful knee replacement surgery on his way back to India. He stopped over in Zurich, Switzerland, and the Tibetan community here had the good fortune of being able to offer a long life prayer, offering, and also hear from His Holiness and have this collective audience with him. So everybody is concerned about where the community is going to go, after His Holiness, and will there be a 15th Dalai Lama, and how would the whole process of selecting, His Holiness reincarnation, how would that be handled? How would that play out? And this is something which not just the Tibetan community, but the larger Buddhist world and internationally, this is an issue of growing concern and interest. And so, again, I think we have to be very cognizant of how this issue plays out, because once we move into the post His Holiness, 14th Dalai Lama era, then I think everything becomes uncertain in terms of what happens to the Tibetan freedom movement, what happens to the CTA, what happens to the democracy and governance exile that has been set up mainly, as a result of His Holiness' vision and kind of the leadership that he's demonstrated over the past many decades. So this looming issue of His Holiness now being almost 80 years old, he will be, 90 years old, he will be 90 next July. And kind of, he was already stepping back, right? In 2011, as I mentioned earlier, he transferred all his political and administrative responsibilities over to the elected Tibetan leadership. But now, I think Tibetans are seeing even less of him. So what does all this mean for the CTA? What does it mean for Tibetan Community-in-Exile? These are very, very major questions. So that's why I picked that as the top three issues. You can also call them challenges. And then the last one is really about the exiled democracy. What the Tibetans have done under the leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan elders is really, really laudable. It's highly commendable in terms of the commitment, to the path of democracy, which can be very challenging, right? As I've outlined in the paper, most exile governments, most freedom movements are inherently authoritarian. And I've cited example of the Palestinians, where the current Palestinian president, he hasn't held an election now for many, many years. And it's essentially, as Freedom House has defined, the Palestinian leadership is categorized as authoritarian in nature. So in many ways, I think it would have been easier if Tibetans had just one single leader, one single decision maker, one single kind of voice. But despite the challenges, the Tibetans have really held steadfast to the democratic practices, and the commitment to democracy is very, very strong. But having said that, I think we are now seeing signs that, given that it's still a very young democracy, we're having to cope with many, many challenges, right? And I've cited a few examples in terms of the issues that have come up during the Sikong elections, how negative some of these elections have become. The crisis we had back in 2021, when we had a period where the newly elected parliamentarians could not take oath, the Sikong could not form his cabinet, the CTA budget could not be passed in time. And for a while, we were actually really looking at the distinct possibility of CTA shutting down. But thankfully, His Holiness had to intervene, and that got resolved. But again, I think these are warning signs that the kind of democracy that we have right now in the Tibetan exile and diaspora community, it's still very fragile, as I've defined, and I think it raises a lot of issues and questions about, are there better alternatives ahead? Can we do something different? Do we have to go down the path that we are currently on, given that the Tibetan community outside Tibet is very small, and our main purpose really should be advancing the freedom struggle? So again, we can discuss more later in terms of what might be some of those solutions or possible alternative paths. But the democracy as it's being practiced now, where there's very little responsibility and people have more and more rights, I think the rights and the responsibilities, Sakina, are not going really hand in hand, which I think it's usually problematic, because what that does is then you have a lot of polarization. You have just kind of this factionalism, in the community, which can, I think, if not checked and if not addressed in a timely, effective manner, I think these issues could then get bigger and bigger, and it could be really problematic down the road.
Thank you, Kedola, for your detailed response and for highlighting this really important critical issues that the CTA and the Tibetan exile government needs to take notice of. Firstly, being the Xi Jinping's hardline policy of total assimilation. Secondly, the succession of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And thirdly, like you mentioned, the factionalism in the exile democracy. It's clear that tackling these issues is essential for the future of Tibetan governance in exile. And another issue in the Tibetan democracy is the separation of the church and the state. In paper, you mentioned that Tibetans need to fully embrace the concept of Chösi Sungdil, or the coexistence of religion and politics. Could you elaborate on this idea and explain how it fits into the modern framework of Tibetan democracy and governance? Kedola.
Sure, Sakina. Yeah, when we talk about Tibetan democracy, I think we need to really look at it from a very broad perspective and also think it through more carefully. Because now, I'm not saying the framers of our charter in exile, the Tibetan Charter in Exile, or the people, including His Holiness the Dalai Lama, when they imagined a Tibetan democracy in exile, that they were discussing some of the things, or they had in mind some of the things which I'm about to share. But I wouldn't be surprised if that was indeed the case. Because when His Holiness and our elders started putting this foundation together, I honestly don't think it was to replicate 100% of Western model of democracy, like you have in the US or in the UK or even in India. The case I've tried to make in the position paper that we're discussing is we really have to lean into our unique Tibetan Buddhist culture. It's not something I think we should shy away from, because for me, it's almost impossible to separate Tibetan culture and Tibetan identity from Tibetan Buddhism. So, yeah, think about this for a minute. When you imagine Tibet, when you imagine Tibetan identity, what are some of the dominant associations or images that come to mind? Besides the mountains and the landscapes, you have the nomads, you have the flora and fauna and special, animal species which are unique to the Tibetan plateau. But then you also have the whole monasteries and nunneries and, monks and nuns and the clergy, in the maroon robes. So what I'm trying to say here is, while we study and while we integrate a lot of the practices and values related to democracy, but I think we also have to dip into our own culture, our own Buddhist culture, our own Buddhist heritage to help shape that democracy. I don't think we should shy away from it. So that's the first point. The second point is the issue of separating church and state is a really important one. But my view on this is we should almost hold off on that, trying to find a resolution on that anytime soon, because right now we're in exile, and we have this this really important task at hand, which is to restore freedom and bring about justice, right? And restore the dignity of the Tibetan people. And also, as most Tibetans have openly expressed, to see that His Holiness is able to return to Tibet. So while we have this massive struggle, I think for us to be discussing some of these very important issues without the input, without participation of the people in Tibet, where, as we all know, almost 99% of the population is back home, right? So we can have this debate, a conclusive discussion, once we all go back to a free Tibet, and then see how the people in Tibet, how they want to take this forward. So until then, I think we shouldn't be we shouldn't lose track of the immediate goal that's in front of us, right? Which is to really counter what the Chinese government is doing. And even more relevant, Sakina, is what is the Tibetan struggle essentially about? It is about preserving and protecting, right, the Tibetan identity and Tibetan Buddhism, which, as we all know, the Chinese Communist government and the Chinese leaders are hell-bent on almost, I would say, eradicating Tibetan Buddhism from Tibet. So when the Buddha himself is facing this immediate risk of being, I guess, exterminated back in Tibet at the source of, where our culture springs from, how can we be even be discussing separating the clergy from the lay people? Because what's animating the clergy? Why are people who are in robes? Why is even His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who is a monk? He's a monk, right? He said he's a simple Buddhist monk. So why are people like His Holiness and other prominent spiritual people in the Tibetan community, why are they having to, alongside their scriptures, why are they having to participate in this political struggle, because the faith itself, right, the Tibetan Buddhist faith itself is at stake. So when the Buddha himself is being, at risk of being exterminated, I just don't think a discussion around, in politics and in our political struggle, we should separate the lay community from the clergy. I really think we need to harness, we need to collectively mobilize and work hand in hand with the monastic community. And in fact, I would say that there's actually even some sort of a disconnect, in terms of the faith community in the Tibetan community, which is the Buddhist community, which is the High Lamas, the spiritual teachers. In fact, I think they need to be even more closely involved in not just participating, but actually leading some of these activities and this movement towards restoring the rights and dignity of Tibetan people. So I just think, I think we sometimes get carried away, and we kind of, I think, are missing, the larger picture. And I honestly think that there is an opportunity here, Sakina, to shape a model of Tibetan democracy that's grounded on core Tibetan Buddhist values, which is very compatible, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama himself has said on numerous occasions. The core Buddhist principles are not in conflict, but they're actually compatible with democracy. I think there is a real special opportunity to shape a model, a version of Tibetan democracy, which we can actually then present, and hopefully other Buddhist communities, other Buddhist governments can maybe study and either replicate wholesale or parts of it. And this is something which I know His Holiness the Dalai Lama has mentioned many times. But if you look at some of the things happening in China, right? My paper mentions this Pew Research Center. They carried out a survey in China last year in 2023. And as much as 33% of the population in China, the Chinese people, they believe in the Buddha, which translates to almost 340 plus million people. And you compare that with how large is the Chinese Communist Party membership? Is about 98 million based on 2022 numbers. So I know this is ideating, and this is like getting very idealistic, I guess, in some respects. But I think rather than kind of be worried and be wary of associating Tibetan Buddhism and monastic community and Tibetan monks and nuns with the kind of democracy we're trying to fashion, I think we should embrace it and really take the good things, out of leaning into Tibetan Buddhism, and take the good things and then shape a democracy which has all the good things of what a Western democracy or Indian democracy looks like, but then it also has Tibetan characteristics. So I think this is actually an exciting discussion we should be having, and we should do it not in a very defensive way. I think we should really just embrace who we are as a culture, as a community, and see how Buddhism can inform a version of Tibetan democracy that could be a model for communities.
Thank you so much, Kedola. And I also found it interesting how the report highlights the potential of this model to differentiate Tibetan governance from other democratic systems, showing that tradition and modern governance can coexist and complement each other effectively. Another example that you gave, Kedola, was regarding the Swiss model of collective executive leadership. Besides many other ideas that you have proposed in your position paper regarding strengthening Tibetan democracy and governance in exile. So can you expand on this model a little bit? And how do you believe that this Swiss model can help overcome the challenges, Kedola?
Yeah, this one is very important, Sakina. I know the position paper, there are so many changes and reforms proposed, and maybe some people might I wouldn't blame them if they think, oh, this is like really just a real wish list and quite hard to implement. But if there is, among the many changes and reforms proposed and suggested in this paper, if there's one particular reform idea which if we can move towards and which can really have a dramatic payoff for us, is this issue that you just raised, Sakina. And that is the current Tibetan governance system, the current Tibetan democracy. I think we have put too much trust and too much faith in the powers and in the capabilities of an individual. Because as you know, the current Tibetan model of executive leadership is really dependent, particularly on the office of the Sipyong, the president. And so every 5 years, Tibetans over the last 3 election cycles have been, the candidates have been campaigning, and their surrogates and their supporters have been out both openly and discreetly trying to elevate and try to get the candidate of their choice elected, right? Which is very much like a US presidential system. But I'm now beginning to think, Sakina, that perhaps given where we are in terms of the situation of the Tibetan exile and Tibetan diaspora community, given that we are fundamentally in this business of trying to counter the Chinese government, I don't think that this model of executive leadership where everything is dependent on one person really works for us or really works for the Tibetan community. And so these days, I'm based in Switzerland. I live in Zurich, and as I was doing the research for this paper, and as I started learning more and more about the Swiss governance system, the Swiss government, I became more and more fascinated. So as I've explained in the paper, the Swiss model essentially boils down to what they call the Federal Council, which is like the cabinet, the kashab the Tibetans have. And so there are 7 people who are elected by the Federal Assembly, which is the Swiss parliament. And these people are elected for a term of 4 years, and their regular day job is to manage their respective ministries, their departments. But the fascinating thing about this, Sakina, is the Swiss model is that there isn't like power, like complete power vested on one person called president. In fact, the post of the president gets rotated, amongst the 7 ministers, and so they each get to become a president for 1 year, so you have 7 people, and as you know, the more people you have, you're going to get more views, more opinion, more positions. So I'm sure the Swiss Federal Council, they have the disagreements, and I'm sure they have very lively debates and sometimes maybe even heated debates. But when it's time to make a decision, it's made collectively and it's based on, I guess, a majority. And when they come out, regardless of whatever difference of views and opinions they may have had on that particular issue or on that decision, but when they come out as one. So I really think it's time, especially given the needs of the Tibetan community, that we stop relying on the capabilities and the leadership of one singular person, that we also have, a version of the Swiss cabinet where we have, instead of electing one Sipyong every 5 years, we in fact elect a cabinet, a shak. And it could be, in my paper, I've suggested 5 because I've also, made some suggestions about consolidating the departments from 7 to 5. So you could have 5 ministers and they each get to be Sipyong for 1 year. I think this could really work very well for the Tibetans. So I don't have concerns of, I'm sure, as I've said earlier, that these 5 individuals, they can have disagreements internally, and I'm sure they will have disagreements internally, but decisions will be made collectively. And as you know, we have the 3 traditional provinces. So my suggestion is that as you elect the 5 ministers, 5 colonies, you have at least 1 from each of the 3 provinces, and the other 2 could be from any of the 3 provinces. You have 5 people. So what we're saying is, let's all do this collectively. And everybody in the Tibetan community talks about unity, promoting unity, harnessing the collective, capacity. So what better way than working as a team, where you have 5 people putting their heads together as opposed to 1 person, right? So I think from a community unity standpoint, from the quality of the decision and getting the buy-in and support of the majority of the exile and diaspora community from that standpoint, and most importantly, I think from the standpoint of being able to effectively counter the Chinese Communist government, I can't think of a better model than the Swiss version of collective executive leadership. So I really think the charter, the Tibetan Charter on Exile, this will entail obviously amending the charter. So I really think the charter should be amended, and we should replace the current presidential style executive leadership with a more collective model, which I think is better suited to the Tibetan community, the Tibetan cultural, I guess, ethos, and also most importantly to the current needs of our community.
Thank you so much, Kedola. The Swiss model seems fascinating. Not very familiar with this kind of leadership, but I'm sure it's going to be a really interesting one if it's proposed in the Tibetan community. And Kedola,
add, the Swiss system works like flawlessly, I would say. And there's so much support. There was a survey done recently, and 7.3 out of 10 respondents said, they have full support for the Federal Council. So the Swiss model is not only more democratic, but it works really well. And the Swiss have shown that, they can do it. And why can't a Tibetan exile community that's less than 200,000 people? I think if we all put our hearts and minds into it, I think we can really come up with a better system.
Thank you, Kedola. And you also propose significant reforms for the Tibetan Parliament-in-Exile, including the transition to a bicameral legislature and the reorganization of the parliamentary seats. So what specific advantages do you believe these changes will bring? Kedola.
Yeah, I'm aware that these are very huge changes that are being suggested here. And again, I'm not an expert on legislative area, and I'm not saying that this is what we should be doing on a permanent basis. So when we go back to Free Tibet, the people in Tibet can debate as much as they want whether the new legislature in a Free Tibet should be bi or unicameral. And also, I'm not making the suggestion from a place of trying to reduce or negate the power of the current, single house system that we have. The place that I'm coming from, Sakina, is, as I've said on earlier occasions now, the Tibetan exile and diaspora community is really, really small. 150,000 people is just so tiny, right? So we should have a CTA, we should have a community, we should have a freedom movement where everyone is encouraged to participate and contribute. And right now you have people who are retired, people who are former this, former that, and all I see them doing is they come to attend events and they normally get, a VIP seat, front row, or they get to sit on the stage. Well, all that's great, they deserve it. But I really think that as we all live longer, so nowadays people are living into the 80s and 90s, so that's just societal trend in general. But these are people who have, tons and tons of experience, right? So why not set up a system where we can actually tap into kind of their expertise and their capabilities, and we create a space for them to not retire for good because the work at hand has not been done, right? I mean, I'm sure a lot of Tibetans have heard His Holiness the Dalai Lama himself say, all of you guys are retiring, what about me, right? So and when you hear that, I mean, I've always felt really kind of, sad about it because it's so true, right? I mean, how come, everything is thrown on the shoulder of one person, and so many of us now, have the education and have the skill set. So my idea, Sakina, is that from a pre-selected pool, and I listed, who could be in this pre-selected group, there should be a body of people, and they don't need to, it doesn't need to be much, it could be 1/3 the current size of the parliament, but they could form, and it could be called, I don't know, maybe the name could be different, but they could form like the upper house, and this body will not be authorized to make or change policies, but they can make non-binding recommendations. But most of all, they can actually contribute and widen the kind of the discourse, and also play kind of the advisory role, so it's not just CTA programs or CTA financial issues, but more importantly, how do we not just sustain, but how do we advance the Tibetan freedom struggle? And so really we are now at a point where we have to create points of connection. We have to create an opportunity for everybody to participate. And it cannot be like, oh, I was in the CTA for this many years, but now I'm retired. There's really there's no space for retirement. So having an upper house, I think, will hopefully, address some of this need. So that's really essentially where this paper comes from.
Thank you, Kedola, for detailing your thoughts on the reforms. And the changes that you mentioned in the legislature sounds like it could bring much needed diversity and a deeper representation to the decision-making process. And the paper also mentions, which I found really interesting, is that the need for a CTA 2.0 and for the CTA to become a South Asia-centric to a transnational entity. So what are the key steps needed to achieve this transformation, and how can the CTA effectively engage with the Tibetan diaspora to strengthen the transnational identity?
Yep. So this one, Sakina, as I mentioned in one of our earlier Q&As, there are many things in this paper which could be a choice, right? So if the CTA, if the Tibetan Parliament, if people who can effect some of the changes suggested in this paper, I think the community can probably get away without doing some of these things. But if there is one area where I think the CTA does not have a choice, the community does not have a choice but to adapt and to move in this direction, is this idea of a CTA 2.0. And I see this because there are all these changes happening, and if CTA is not careful and not vigilant and not proactive enough, I worry that a point will come where the CTA becomes irrelevant. So it's to fight back, if not for anything, for CTA's own future relevance, to address future relevance, that we have to now, because one large community trend, as we discussed earlier, was this outbound migration. So this is something that CTA has no control. This contraction of the refugee community in India, Nepal, and South Asia is happening spontaneously, and there's not much anybody can do to stem that. So rather than try to, fight it or to kind of throw up your hands and say, oh, it's really bad and there's not much we can do, I think the CTA needs to adapt and follow the community. So when the people first came from Tibet, this whole exile setup was created, right, in 59 and the 60s. But now, as close to half the population from South Asia, as they migrate overseas, as much as possible, I think the CTA needs to follow and be close to these people as possible, these communities as possible. So that's where I've been pushing in this idea, this concept of CTA morphing, CTA evolving into more of a transnational entity. And this is not just some empty slogan or some word. If CTA and if the community leadership is really seriously about going down this path, then you really have to back it up with programs, with the resource allocation needs to change, right? Some of the priorities need to change. They have to be recognized first and then accordingly change. So you can't operate as you've been operating for the last 65 years, but yet still say, yeah, we're kind of moving down this path, and CTA now is a transnational, because that will not hold water. So and this is not really complicated, Sakina. I think there's a way to do this in a way that's really strategic and also very cost effective and highly impactful. And the path, the outline that I've suggested is, how about replicating the Dharamsala Sane, right? The Dharamsala Shija settlement relationship, and expanding that to Dharamsala, which is the headquarters, HQ, to now we have almost 69 Tibetan associations in Europe, North America, Australia, Southeast Asia, right? Australasia. So I've made some very specific suggestions in this position paper where amendments need to be made to the Tibetan Charter, where the Tibetan Charter recognizes these Tibetan associations as legitimate partners of the CTA. And then on the other side of the equation, these Tibetan associations, which are mostly registered charities in their host countries or towns or cities, you have the bylaws, you have the articles of incorporation, which are the two major documents that a nonprofit organization should have. So in your bylaws and in your articles of incorporation, these Tibetan associations, they should formalize the relationship and list the CTA as a member, and maybe even like assign board seats for 1 to 2 to 3 representatives from the CTA, and then there needs to be a growing portfolio of programs and activities which the CTA and the Tibetan associations can do together, in a partnership. If you do that, then I think we can have a similar kind of situation where we've had this for many years now, for 65 years, where you had whichever department is concerned in Dharamsala under CTA, and then you had these 44 settlements, right, in India and Nepal. And the reporting structure, the relationship structure, the flow of funding, there's so many levels, right? And I don't think you can create a one-to-one kind of relationship with associations abroad, because, as I've said in the paper, these associations are fiscally and legally autonomous, and that autonomy needs to be preserved. Otherwise, they might lose their nonprofit status, right? But again, there are ways, based on consultations and input with counseling from the appropriate legal, with lawyers, nonprofit lawyers. I think there is a way to restructure and refashion existing relationship where it's there, but it's still somewhat informal, making it very, very formal. And once you do that, then I think, you've then really transitioned the CTA from being a very South Asia centric, to be more specific, India and Nepal centric, to something which really kind of takes into account and includes the growing population that's living outside South Asia. So that would mean CTA would need to do a lot of restructuring. It needs to right now in terms of if CTA's budget was 100 rupees, I'm not even sure if more than a rupee is being spent on these communities abroad, right? So I think you need to now make room in the budget and allocate resources accordingly. I propose almost a quarter of all the foreign funding that we get, that a quarter of that should actually go towards programs which are done in collaboration between CTA and these various Tibetan associations. So that way, regardless of a community member, whether she's living in New Zealand or whether she's living in, I don't know, Tuting, Arunachal Pradesh, you're all going to feel that bond and that connection to the CTA. You're going to feel it because there are some tangible manifestations of that relationship. As opposed to now, where I mean, in Switzerland, where I'm living now, I'm sure many people here, especially the younger generation, I mean, they can go, an entire year with no interaction with CTA. And I'm sure, many might not even be fully aware of what the CTA is up to or what the CTA does. So if you continue down this path, I worry that, we're just driving CTA into irrelevance. So this is an imperative. It's not a choice. I really think the sooner the current CTA leadership of the executive and the legislature, as well as some of the people who are leading all these different community associations, we need to come together and I think really have this discussion and come up with a plan of action. So that, in the framework that I've outlined, you have the CTA headquarters at the core, you have the 44 settlements in India and Nepal, and then you have a third layer, which is the 6-9 or so, and this could increase, right? 6-9 or so, Tibetan associations spread across, I don't know, six continents, and so that's really, I guess, to explain what my understanding and my recommendation for a CTA 2.0 might look like.
Thank you, Kedorla. And I could completely relate this personally because before even I joined CTA, I had no idea that CTA had existed, unfortunately. So I agree that strengthening ties with Tibetans globally and your insights on the steps needed, such as developing a global network of community centers and leveraging digital platforms, are key strategies that can help CTA engage more effectively with Tibetans worldwide. And another thing in your report, besides the three critical issues that we spoke earlier, is that you have outlined 5 key areas of focus under CTA 2.0, ranging from earlier childhood development to the advancement of Tibetan language. Can you briefly go over the 5 points?
Yeah, this one, Sakina, I think it relates to an earlier comment I made about how it needs to be a whole of community approach to the fundamental challenges that we face, right? As a movement, as an external community, and as a people. The suggestion I've made is you can't have CTA doing everything. So the CTA, and then you have the faith, the Buddhist community, and then you have even the developing community. Because right now, I worry that sometimes we all kind of operate in a very disconnected way, each assuming that we're doing different things. But we don't recognize the common goal that we all have and the common threat we face, right? So I think what I've suggested, one way to kind of substantiate, one way to move forward with the CTA 2.0 model is in some of these programs that we implement, I think it needs to take into account kind of this whole of community approach. I really feel like, yeah, when we put a project plan together, we have to really reconsider some of the fundamental assumptions. We cannot operate like how an NGO or how a project operates in a free, independent country, right? Because in any project that is designed, I think you really have to ask 2 or 3 fundamental questions. One is, how is this advancing the Tibetan freedom struggle? How is this fostering unity amongst kind of, different sections of the community? And if, while you're trying to answer these questions, if some of these big projects, the answer is no, 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 then I really think, you need to go back to the donor and say, no, we need to frame this differently. So in that kind of a situation, one of the areas where I feel, and 65 years, it's really a long time span, Sakin. And if we had done this about 30 years ago, I think the community today would have been in a much more stronger position. But better, better late than never, right? So I feel like we've lost, 2 or 3 generations of Tibetans who are what they are now. I think it's hard to try to now shape them or try to push them in a certain direction. But where the community does have control, and where we, with the right program, with the right allocation of resource, we can really still make a difference, is in the next generation of Tibetans, in the infant to the 8-year-old generation, right? And that's why the early childhood development ECD, I know the education department, CTA, and others are discussing this, and there have been small steps taken in this towards this direction. But I think much more needs to be done because when the Tibetan elders, when they set up the different public school systems, I think awareness and understanding of ECD concepts was, I wouldn't say non-existent, but really, really low. But we really cannot miss out on the opportunity of forming the next generation of Tibetans. Many of them might go on to become leaders, and their contribution is going to be critical, right, in terms of whether the movement survives, whether the culture survives, whether the identity survives. So ECD should really be the front and center of not only the exile education policy, but also I think how we do most of the project-funded programs. So that was the first thing I wanted to just touch on. Then the public school systems themselves. I mean, I think I've used some pretty strong language in the paper in terms of calling them a relic of the past. But really, that is what they have become. They were great and they served a purpose when they were first set up. But now I think, given the changes and given the developments happening both internally and externally, we cannot maintain the status quo where right now, in a diminishing pool of students, we continue to maintain 3 separate public school systems and plus 1 in Nepal, right? So I've advocated for consolidation, integration. We should just have one school system, and it should be managed autonomously. It should not be under the education department. It should be managed autonomously by a group of representatives from the current 3 school systems, and resources should be provided. And because unless we change the way our young children and students are being educated, I feel like this will have ramifications far and beyond. And we need to now just move away from quantity. We have so many schools where the enrollment is dropping, and people know, people both in the group that manages these school systems as well as in the Tibetan community, we know that we've got to consolidate. We know that we have to make a major push towards quality. But now I think we have to find the will and the leadership to make it happen. So that was the second one. And then I think we also really need to look north. By north, I mean the communities that we've established over the last 6 decades, all along the Tibet border, right? All ranging from the northwest Ladakh to all the way to Nepal and Arunachal Pradesh. Unfortunately, these settlements, these communities have been getting depopulated. I think we need to try to stem that. We need to try to provide some incentives and see how we can encourage people who are already there to stay, and maybe have some of the people who are not in settlements, if they can relocate to some of these northern settlements. And I think it's important for 2 reasons. One, for the advancement of a struggle, because what the Chinese are doing on their side of the Tibet border is, I think, well documented, right? All these new village and townships that they're building, and kind of the areas that are being populated by essentially Tibetans, but under Chinese control, right? And so I think we need to really try to, not that we can match what the Chinese, the PRC is doing, but at least we can try to counter some of that. But equally important, both for cultural reasons and as well as also for political reasons, we need to strengthen the ties with the Buddhist communities that are living all across this Himalayan belt. So for these two fundamental reasons, I think we need to focus more on the northern settlements, because a lot of resources and attention have gone to the south, and that's great. That's been a really a complete success story. But now I feel like those southern settlements and some of the ones like in the north, they've done well. I think there's now the components and elements are in place for them to almost operate autonomously, with some minimal support from the CTA. But now, if some of the resources and attention could shift slightly towards these northern settlements in Ladakh, in Sikkim, in Arunachal Pradesh, in Nepal, I think that's where it makes sense, from a freedom struggle, from a freedom movement point of view. And then I've also talked about the electoral reforms, and I won't get into too much detail about it. People should, welcome to read the paper. But I've made some very specific recommendations in terms of how we can increase transparency and enhance participation. And then lastly, to add to this transparency and access issue, it's so hard for people to get information on the CTA, on what the Kashak is doing, on what the Tibetan Parliament-in-Exile is up to. I really feel, and this is something, again, it's not a choice. I think it's an imperative and something that should be done ASAP, which is we need to have a bilingual digital platform where information on the parliament and on the Kashak is readily available. When I say information, I mean, what are the votes that's been cast, and who has voted for what are the different bills and resolutions. Similarly, on the executive side, what are some of the key policies and programs and initiatives, how are they doing, and so that the people who these two pillars are representing, right, they have more access, they have more information. This all relates to the open government, open data, which is a very established concept, especially in the West. But I think when it comes to the Tibetan community, access has been a major issue. And I think it's hard for people to make decisions in the absence of information. So that's how when people listen to, so-and-so asked me, told me this is a good person, I should vote for him. Or there's all kinds of, misinformation then. So people really need to have access to information themselves so that they can independently, be informed and make the decision. Yeah.
Thank you, Kedola, for going over those key focus areas. And these priorities definitely cover the most pressing needs of the Tibetan community. So many of the reforms that you propose in the paper will involve amending the charter of the Tibetans in exile, which requires a two-thirds of the votes in the Tibetan parliament, a process that could be challenging and potentially costly. So in your view, what is needed and how do you see some of the ideas and reforms translating into action, Kedola?
Yeah, as I've said several times now, the ideas and proposals and other reforms suggested, proposed in this document is quite a lot to consider, and I totally get that. But again, I feel like the Tibetan community does not really have a choice with some of these changes that we need. And I think the bigger we can imagine, the higher we shoot for, at least we can end up somewhere, right? If we do what we're doing now, I mean, let's talk about what the Tibetan Parliament-in-Exile has done. So there was a lot of debate and discussion around amendments and making some changes. But then in the previous sessions we've seen of the Tibetan Parliament-in-Exile, the changes that were addressed and things that were kind of, taken on board were very small incremental changes. So the Tibetan Parliament-in-Exile is now going to be meeting in 2 days' time. And I really hope that, and I've sent this paper individually to most of the Tibetan MPs. through Facebook. There's some that I couldn't find on the Facebook, but I've sent the secretariat, who I hope will at least share this with all the 45 members. I've also sent it individually to as many of the MPs I could find on Facebook, which, as you know, it's a popular platform that most Tibetans use. And I really think it's a chance for MPs to take this big picture position and see. And again, I don't think all the things that have been suggested are feasible here, but at least which are the ones which could be done and should be done. And but again, I know there's a lot to ask for, and the way change happens usually, it's really hard for changes to emanate from the inside, right? And as we know, Tibetan community is a very change-averse community. So I'm not under any illusions that many of these proposals here that are made for reform will happen right away. As I've said in the introductory section, one of the major objectives behind doing the research and putting this paper out there is to really encourage people to have a dialogue around this. It's not important who wrote this paper, because in this current environment where we have, all kinds of, kind of unfortunate factionalism, I think people should not really put much attention to who wrote this paper and where is it really coming from. I think what I would urge my fellow Tibetans to do is to really, and our supporters, to do is really focus on the merit of what's being proposed. And if you see some that are really, oh, that makes a lot of sense, and I'm sure we can do it with some organizing and some leadership, then focus on those, right? And discuss and see how we can. And as I've said in my social media posts, please read, please share, please debate, and then act if you can. So I'm putting a lot of my hope on the community and trusting that they will get this because time is running out. Time really is running out, and there are, as I said at the beginning of session, there is a real confluence of events and issues all merging together for us as a community and as a freedom movement, and in terms of identity and in terms of our freedom struggle. And I think if we don't handle the next 2-3 years correctly, I feel like a lot of the challenges that are inherent in this space that we're now in, those could become unmanageable. So just simply talking about it and just giving very long lectures and saying all the right things, I think that moment is gone. I think it's really now time to discuss and time to come down and land on some very specific action items, and then just follow through. So it's really more of a plea, more of a hope that both our current parliamentarians who will be meeting in a couple of days for their fall session, that at least you could bring up some of these issues in the paper during the course of the parliamentary session, but mostly to the people out there, to the community members, that it's really now time to seriously look at some of these issues and see what we can do individually and as a group and as a community. So that's really my hope.
Thank you, Kedola, for sharing your vision and your thoughtful insights through your position paper, Reimagining Tibetan Democracy and Governance. And I really hope that this report will be viewed positively. We Tibetans, we believe in democracy, and everybody, they have the right to express their views. And thank you so much, Kedola, for putting in the effort to write this paper. And for those interested in reading the full report, it is available on Asia Freedom Institute's website under the publications section. So Kedola, I'm going to end this session. Before that, if you have anything to say, I'll give you some time. If you
I think, in conclusion, I'll just repeat what I said earlier. This is, we're now entering a time when more than words, actions matter. And some of the changes and reforms proposed in the position paper is not even a choice, I would say. It's an imperative. And I think the sooner we recognize that and do something about it, the better off the community and the movement will be. And lastly, I think people should feel empowered. We should not throw this onto one individual or onto just the CTA, current CTA officials. I think it falls on all of us because we are stakeholders in this process, and so we should all kind of make a commitment to do something and really act.
Thank you so much, Kedullah. And I would like to thank everyone involved, our viewers. I see that there are lots of comments today. Thank you so much, everyone, for being with us till the end. And I would also like to say that the video of the session will be uploaded on AFI's website. And please follow AFI's X, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Instagram pages for more information on AFI's programs and activities. And I would also like to remind you that we are also available both on Apple Podcast and YouTube. Thank you.